I'm going to try something a little new today, which is a talk as a road trip, which is so much a part of my experience communicating with people. I figure if I can get someone in a car for a short amount of time, at least we both know the story will end when we get there. So thank you, Robert Crouch, for the invitation to share my story of bending the river back into the city as part of your free radical curation. I remember the last time we were here at this virtual site we're looking at together in my subjective location. You came to cheer 100 mules walking the Los Angeles Aqueduct on as we rode through the sculpted boulders of the Alabama hills. Next time you come up, Robert, drive just past this point where we're looking now to the Whitney Portal Road, turn west, and drive in for a couple of miles until you get to the Alabama hills. Immerse yourself there in the great silence of that place, a glacial time score. And of course, the art space of Otto Pina and Charlotte Norman's Sky Kiss, which I had also actually forgotten about. Time can be experienced in myriad ways, especially here. One of the reasons I thought to explore a road trip as a form of communication today is that time, the time it takes to drive from here to there, 3.5 hours of mostly monotonous driving, is a unit of time that it takes to experience the infrastructure that moves snowmelt from the Eastern Sierra to us here in Los Angeles. Even during the long, hot, dry days, there's a dependable water supply from there. Water actually makes that journey in 3 days from the Eastern Sierra to Sylmar, where it's literally hooked into what we call the LA River. When Metabolic Studio walked this 240 miles of channels, ditches, and pipes, we could measure the distance in the mule strides we rode. It takes a mule 1 month of mule strides to walk the Los Angeles Aqueduct, walking in a string of 10, in a chain of 10 strings, walking steadily all day, with only a couple of water breaks. 1 month of mule strides to walk the Los Angeles Aqueduct. I should say thank you here to the Department of Water and Power for allowing this action to occur and for the water it provided us for the mules to drink for. This was a collaboration in many ways with them to celebrate the mule for its role in building the aqueduct and to have a parade through every place the aqueduct passes. I should say the mule was also the labor force that built the Panama Canal at the same time, and a few years later the Hoover Dam. Driving time and the measurement of supply and demand of water seemed to me to be a theme for myself, a way to understand. Here's another measurement that has shaped the ambition of my practice. To irrigate 32 acres of the industrial site that I grew 32 acres of corn, it took 90 miles of irrigation stripping. 90 miles. That's when I realized that remediation action of Notacornfield on what was once a fertile crescent, now that land is held in trust for all of us through the California State Park System. Wouldn't it be good and wouldn't it be right to reconnect the historic floodplain of the LA River so that clean soil and water could again be brought together? And what if a water commons could be put in place? Water could be constructed as social capital. But how? These long road trips really help to try and figure it out. But look there in the distance on the left. What are we looking at the shores of what used to be a giant lake? It's the Pittsburgh Plate Glass Factory. How do we systematically clean up the toxins in and around the industrial corridor so that if the river and the land are reconnected, the cocktail it creates won't be lethal to living systems, most especially the Pacific Ocean? And how do we take water out of a system like the one you're looking at now out our window? How do we take water out of a system that sees it as a commodity and reestablish it again as a commons? Whose commons? From where? It's definitely time to think of a post-capital driven water utility. Ask me more about this later. I really don't want to go too far on this ride, especially passing PPG, without an offering to the Paiute people who have lived in this sacred valley for millennia and who still make their home in and around the Owens dry lake bed you're looking at here. Their ancestors' bones are buried below the surface of the land you're looking on now. It's another very ugly colonial settler story. I've learned so many things from Kathy Bancroft, a Paiute leader who I now consider a friend. She has to continually battle to create sanctuary for her ancestors here, as this place is now a federally acknowledged disaster. The dust you see out there is unhealthy enough to be of a federal concern. And how the state of California figures into it is that it organizes that body as a lake for people and leases the water to the city of LA. The city of LA now has to answer to the federal problem. From Kathy's perspective, water is sacred and the dry lake bed should be allowed to heal itself. Yet some of the dust remediation strategies are an incredible waste of money and time. We've spent more than $1 billion and the clock is still ticking and the problem's not solved. So bending the river back into the city is about the larger picture of our water supply and what a sacrificial lake creates in terms of long-term liabilities for all living systems. The perimeter of Los Angeles turns out to be way larger than the county. It includes our inextricable relationship with our water source here in the valley. When I first drove up here, beginning in 2001, looking for where Los Angeles was, with my children and our golden retriever to relish the silence of the Alabama hills, I found myself immersed in a spectral light dancing through dancing vortices of white dust on an immense scale. I would later find out that this beauty was a complex and sly villain. I knew I had to do something. When you look forward out the window at what looks like a natural setting, is actually land carefully kept devoid of industry. The nothing you see around you is a plan. Most everything around is owned by the city of Los Angeles to secure our water supply. And it's controlled so private interest doesn't challenge that water supply. And that's not entirely a bad thing, because otherwise Howard Hughes would have built Las Vegas here. So while we drive this road together for the next little while, I'll try and impress upon you that we are 3.5 hours outside of downtown Los Angeles, yet in the city at the same time. My studio team makes this drive often, many of whom are here today on our tour. I'd like to give a call out to my colleague Millie Mason-Moore for her incredible work with the Native people in the Owens Valley. Our studio has been supporting food sovereignty for them, as well as following through in our many conversations about envisioning practicable improvements through discussions with LADWP currently having as a result of leveraging my water right. Okay, water rights. I need to explain. To provide LA river water to the State Historic Park in downtown LA, the site of Notacornfield, the site of the 90 miles of irrigation stripping, the LA DWP said to hook that site back up to the LA River, I would need to do the labor, get the permits of lifting the water and cleaning it, but I also, once I did it, would need to pay them to give it away. Okay, I said, is there a plan B? And they said, well, up until now, we're the only sanctioned water provider for the city of Los Angeles, but I suppose you could apply for a water right. I said, okay, well, how do I do that? And they gave me a website, and I applied for a water right, and I assume they thought, okay, there goes that crazy artist who walked the 100 mules on the LA Aqueduct. Luckily, we won't hear from her again. Only to find out in March 2014 that the California State Water Board is granting me the first private water right in the city of Los Angeles. So they suggested that I apply for the water right, and I got it, and bending the river back into the city has required, in order to do it, more than 60 interconnected permits and approvals from 23 federal, state, regional, county, and city agencies. This is, by the way, to just knock 2 small holes in the concrete river jacket, put a temporary dam in place, and then just clean the water to give it away. I mean, that's just for that. So the linchpin agreement was the water right, and the water right needs to be said it cannot be bought or bartered for. The water right is something given because it's a risk that I feel the California Water Board knew it needed to make, and I'm a relatively safe bet. You can ask me more about that later too. So I got the city of Los Angeles' first water right, but what do I do because I don't believe in water rights? So I'm now working with language, changing the language of the contractual agreements with the agencies that are going to get water. So I'm talking to them about sharing my water responsibility rather than right. So water is life and ought to be all of our responsibilities to share, especially as we readdress public space. The commons as a social construct needs to be brought into this. It comes from a medieval past when serfs had access to certain free things while working on land they didn't own. Water was a commons and would be drawn from a well. So why not begin to readdress the imbalance that exists? All life systems now need to be replenished and given back to. We cannot continue to extract resource from nature without giving back. The Metabolic Studio is about this readdressing. The very nature of the title of this inspiring symposium, Free Radicals. We artists, like the elements Margaret Wertheim described in her keynote yesterday, have the potential to link up with elements, other elements, and form bonds that make whole new elements. A metabolic sculpture is about that. It's about repositioning art practice in the sphere of radical remediation. So that's what we know at Metabolic Studio. We know what to do. The unknown is always how to do it. Currently, I'm working with a very inspired #2 man at the LA DWP, Marty Adams, to try and see if we can make some very real shifts on those remediation ponds you're looking at out the window of this car. Those manicured landscapes are all plans to keep the dust down, and they're not really good enough, and they don't know how to take it farther. He knows this area well, Marty does, having been the company man out here for many years. He also knows that bureaucracy doesn't favor innovation, and to do that, you need an artist, and an artist you can trust is hard to find. That's his words. Derived from the Greek word for change, metabolism is the process that maintains life in continuous cycles of creation and destruction. Metabolism transforms nutrients into energy and form. Not A Cornfield responded to the wider struggle of local people to create a safe place to recreate and have a decent urban life in the face of real estate trauma and social unrest. Not A Cornfield's transformation of the land back into a public space, a commons, created the possibility for a deeper public consciousness and a sense of shared ownership of what was once a shared and historic floodplain. Through making interventions and galvanizing public participation, we're developing new tools for urban living and city planning, inventing novel social practices for political and environmental justice, and directing art practice to engage on the same scale society has a capacity to destroy. The shell of Pittsburgh Plate Glass Factory is the sound you hear as we drive. It's coming through a radio station, 89.9 FM. This is a guerrilla radio station that Metabolic Studio Sonic Division has rigged up so that as you drive around this 100-mile lake, you can hear the sounds of the ruin of this building and us cajoling the absences. We've made the silo into a musical instrument that is made musical by the movement of wind on steel strings stretched the length of the silos. And as we drive now around the east side of the lake, we'll be driving past a town called Keeler. I know a sound artist who moved out there to listen to the stars at night. He loves our radio station and being able to carry a portable transistor to mix with the sound of the stars. He hears the ambient sounds of the silo, the owls that live there, the cows that meander past, and most often, the resonant hum of the stringing of the giant silos like an Aeolian harp that continually broadcasts sound in units of time measured by gusts of wind. Douglas Lee, my collaborator on this adaptive reuse of the PPG silo as a musical instrument, is a talented man, not only as a fabricator of sculptural instruments, but as a musician and a teacher. He's best known for his work playing glass and water harmonium. When we began working together 10 years ago, we ran a workshop in the silos, to teach people to play glass and water in an orchestra. And as our videographer, Emily Lacey, is driving around the lake, she's listening to the Sonic Division live from Metabolic Studio in Los Angeles through the silos. Our weekly jam session cycles sound from LA back to the source of our water here. We play to this dry lake as an action of compensation for the water we use here in Los Angeles. It's another kind of cycle or gratitude loop. The Sonic Division plays instruments both made and found. We all play everything, and we play usually for about the same amount of time as the drive takes, 3 to 4 hours. The sound we make is filtered through the hollow resonant silos. These silos were built to contain materials harvested from the dry lake bed and shipped back to Pittsburgh to make glass. At one point, PPG was the second largest employer in the Owens Valley after the LADWP. In the late 60s, a massive flood caused by a snowmelt from an epic year of snow like this one flooded the plant, and the business never recovered. The Los Angeles River is often described as a 51-mile river that has its origin at the Cascades in Sylmar and its delta in Long Beach. This is accurate if you don't consider the source of a river as part of it. Bending the river back into the city looks at this larger picture of flow. From the highest peaks on the American continent, downhill via channels, pipes, and tunnels to get at what we consider the beginning of the river to be. It's an unnatural river now, built out of design to facilitate the growth of Hollywood in the early 20th century, replete with swimming pools and orange groves. The historic floodplain of the Los Angeles River. This story, in a practical way, gets linked to industry. During westward expansion, the site you're looking at now was where the U.S. thought an urban core should be. But the strange station, which I began to work on when it became derelict, became the space for Notacornfield. At this station, mules would be used to support the mining up here. They would be shipped to that train station, and they would walk all the way up to support mining in the Inyo and Sierra, as well as the trains would bring in a large Chinese community that was so key in building the railways. That train station was surrounded by industry, just like the floodplain had been surrounded by life. Water wheels would power this industry. By the time Notacornfield happened in 2005, the train yard had been derelict for a half century. The LA River had been channelized to prevent its regular flooding. Chinatown had been moved to make way for a new train station. Chavez Ravine had been wrecked to make way for Dodger Stadium. And the Alameda Corridor established on the shores of the concrete river channel to connect global trade coming into Long Beach to the rest of the United States. By 2005, every major road except the 405 that carves its way through Los Angeles would make its way through and across the LA River by the site of Notacornfield. By the time I began working at PPG, about the same time, it was an acknowledged environmental disaster area. It was quite a 100-year legacy. The question of what to make and whether to make anything at all led me to work with living systems. When I first met my beloved, I took him out to the Owens Dry Lake for a picnic, just right here on the shores of Keeler Beach. A decade later, we're still working with the physical properties of this lake and with the silver that was mined in the hills around the lake. It's not a surprise that early photographers would come to this area to make photographs. How many of them, though, knew that they were completing a geographic material loop? Silver mined from these mountains would be shipped to Rochester, New York, made into film stock, and shipped back here for movie shoots and photographic expeditions. Rich and I were excited to reinvent photography, to not just take photo of this landscape, but to make a photo out of the landscape. And we were very fortunate that Tristan Duke came to one of our first workshops on the Owens Dry Lake and joined forces with us. Christine Wertheim and Sharon Ryan, who are both here today, were at that event, a 3-day shootout where we made every aspect of a film, 16mm cameras, shot the film, did a community film score, developed the film in scavenged lakebed materials, and edited and screened it in 3 days. After that adventure, everything else really just took off. Rich, Tristan, and I formed the optics division of the Metabolic Studio, and we've made our own silver nitrate from Cerro Gordo silver, coated glass plates with gelatin made from crushed cattle bones, and developed and fixed our imagery with chemistry harvested from the lake you're looking at. Every shot we take is a miracle. Every photographic fixing event is an adventure. We drive out here, right where you are now, and dig a hole in the ground. We bury our human-sized photographic paper in muck and leave it overnight. The active fixing agent is an organic compound called sodium thiosulfate. To bring beauty from the metabolic interaction of organic lake brine and silver from the mountains is a pure metabolic sculpture. What activates the latent silver is light, and what fixes the images is a solution of earth, animal, mineral, and time. I'm so excited by some of our work, I wanted to bring a large picture today with me to share, but maybe next time. So I'm hoping a picture begins to emerge of the Metabolic Studio practice. To start with, these two places, already linked by water for a century, is to attempt to envision a revision of that infrastructure as a sculptural monument, an underground monument that aims at reconnecting living systems. Not A Cornfield, 2005 to 2006, proposed to clean up a train yard. The property had become land banked as an asset of the California State Park System. The title of the work was named because the park was slated to become a state history park, and people in power had concern there was no proof that anything ever like corn grew there. So to alleviate their concerns, I named the work Not A Cornfield. Once the name of the work was agreed, we made the site ready for a corn remediation. We brought in truckloads of soil from other construction sites around the city, laid those 90 miles of irrigation piping that would change my life, and planted corn sourced from and returned to the Native American community. Not A Cornfield responded to the wider struggle of local people to create a safe place to recreate and have a decent urban life in the face of real estate trauma and social unrest. Not A Cornfield's transformation of the land back into a public space, a commons, created the possibility for a deeper public consciousness and a sense of shared ownership of this historic floodplain. It softened the edges of the friction between social justice and access to water that challenges communities and civic agencies in this area of the city. It fulfilled a civic need to envision better and more sustainable ideas for life in compromised urban sites, and acted as a proposal for how we as artists shift the ways of thinking that bring us to our present moment. What lesson I got from that work was that the reconnection of that civic space and the water that runs right by it and out to sea needs to happen. Bending the river back into the city is that proposal. Clearly, we can't unbridle the LA River's concrete downtown without cleaning up the residue of oil tanks and other gunk that are still in the ground. This reconnection of floodplain to river is now got to be dealt with incrementally. Bending the river back into the city began as a proposal to the state of California for a second century of water stewardship in which we reevaluate wastewater. It's hard for me to think of where bending the river back into the city begins and will end. This is the largest and most civically visible of my actions to date, materializing every facet of my practice. I think back to the conception of Metabolic Studio in the traumatic aftermath of 9/11 and the beginning of my endeavors transparently aimed as counter-arguments and alternatives to the anticipated death rattle of neoliberalism. My work is fundamentally a constellation of acts of restitution, of soil and water, of rightful responsibilities to our environment, and of the human spirit and its material survival. The ocean is the catch of the watershed, and the delta is where they meet. In the Owens Valley, you can walk out onto the Owens dry lake bed. There you will find yourself 50 feet below the surface of a ghost. It's a ghost with the weight of 108 square miles of water, a lake that was made of the snowfall up in the Sierra Nevada mountains to the west and the Inyo Mountains to the east, a lake 12 miles long and 8 miles wide, a lake that 100 years ago was ushered by the hands of many men into a pipe that moves across the desert and into my kitchen, a pipe that drained that lake, leaving its ghost to blow with the wind and dust through the valley. Today on the shore of that dry lake bed sits an abandoned glass factory. The sonic division of the Metabolic Studio turned the derelict factory into a musical instrument. It plays a song 100 years long, out over the lake bed. That song is our requiem for water. A requiem is a song to bring rest to the spirit of the dead. This song goes out to the lake. It moves across the valley like a wave, a sound wave, looking in the wind for a ghost to bring it rest. The wave travels through a pipe across the desert to a delta, to the catch, the cup, the room, where the song and the ghost meet and find rest. The catch is a place for rest, a meeting place for the water, the song, the ghost of a lake, and the people who thrive by the gift of the water.